differences between um, pretty big differences between how Eastern and Western Willet spend their time over the course of a year. And so refining that in a way that we can use that eBird data to then make decisions is really important. And I thought, well, what better way of doing that than just trying to convince all of you great folks that use eBird to, to be a little more specific and giving you guys the tools to be able to identify these and maybe feel more confident identifying the species to subspecies. I don't know how wide our footprint is this evening. If most folks are from the Houston or greater Houston area or Texas coastal area, we do get both subspecies throughout the year. If we have anyone joining us from out west, their experience with Eastern Willets is going to be very limited because they don't typically get Eastern Willets. But nevertheless, I think learning how to identify the two is a useful skill. So we're going to start out with just, what is a willet? How do we identify willets? What are some features that are consistent for both subspecies? I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit after that and talk about why I think they deserve attention. Then we're going to get into the kind of nuts and bolts of, it's a time of year that, I'm standing at Bolivar Flats. It's a time of year that both willets occur. How do I tell them apart? And then, in respect to everyone's time, we're going to end with a little bit about the ecology of Eastern and Western willets, some of the differences in migration and some of the stuff that makes them really cool. It's also the stuff that I could talk about forever. So I decided to shove that in at the end. Just if folks only have limited time, they'll at least get the meat of what we're trying to discuss. And then after that, if folks have questions, I think Jesse, if you address your questions to the chat, Jesse will be able to then access those, and we can do a little bit of question and answer at the end, depending on timing.
Yeah, there's actually a Q&A little box that you can actually put your questions in. If you can't figure that out, yeah, put it in the chat, and I'll make sure to ask Wyatt at the end.
Thank you. So, for folks who are unfamiliar with our with the guest of honor this evening, both pictures you see are willets. The one on the left is an Eastern Willet. The one on the right is a Western Willet. The names, really, all the names of this bird are a little bit confusing and for multiple reasons. To start, willets were described originally pretty early on when Europeans started making their way across North America. So,
hey, Wyatt, sorry,
yeah.
time out. I think we only we're on the title block still. And yeah, and we're not seeing the PowerPoint mode.
Did that fix it?
No.
What did I do here?
I'm glad it's not me.
I'm going to stop sharing really quick and then maybe reshare. Or wait, sorry, what's this?
Oh, somebody made a comment about changing to that particular window. But that doesn't make sense. I'm not sure that's...
Let's do this. Did that help? Or what are you guys seeing now?
Western Willet. What is a willet? Why willets? Which willet is it? There we go. 2 willets.
Wait,
on a map now.
Now it says, what is a willet? You've got it. Eastern and Western Willet. There you go.
Cool. All right. Hopefully this works for the remainder of the I think I know what I did wrong. Okay. So willets are named for basically the vocalization they give, which some people hear things differently than others. I don't necessarily hear it, but apparently someone did. But they do a sort of a pila-weet, pila-weet, pila-weet call. Western and Eastern willets sound a little bit different, and that name is more in reference to the Eastern willet than it is to the Western. But and even the name Eastern and Western is confusing. But for the sake of, you know, we'll get into specifically where they occur later, but overall, willets are kind of they're a big gray shorebird. Sometimes they have a little bit more patterning than other times of year, depending on what plumage they're in. But they're generally medium to large shorebirds. They're going to be smaller than a godwit or a curlew, but they're going to be about the size of a greater yellowlegs, maybe a little bit smaller. They're very chunky. They have these pretty thick-based bills that taper to varying degrees depending on the subspecies, and they have dull-colored legs. So that's a pretty definitive mark for when you're looking at all the other shorebirds that are this size and sort of kind of this color or shape, like dowitchers or yellowlegs. They're going to have yellowish legs, whereas these guys typically have very bluish legs. Almost oftentimes they're basically the same color as something like an American Avocet. So that's kind of generally, that's what a willet is. Most definitively, the most definitive field mark is when you see these birds fly, they're going to have, you can kind of see it on the Eastern Willet here. That's kind of why I use that image. The open wing, they have a really striking black and white pattern. And their other shorebirds will have, you know, maybe dark wings with a white bar going down the center, or a wing stripe. But these guys have a really contrasting wing pattern. And so that's a really great tool to use if you see one in flight or fluttering. Immediately you know that's a willet. And one of the reasons why I think this is a species that's worth more attention is even if you're fairly familiar with them, or you see them fairly often, they're an incredibly useful bird to learn as someone who's interested in identifying other shorebirds, because as we'll get into, even if you don't live on the coast, even if you live in Utah or New Mexico, you will encounter willets in migration. And so it's a nice sort of yardstick shorebird that at least, you're scanning through a big group of birds, at least you know that that's a willet, and then all the other birds can kind of fall into place. All those other shorebirds, bigger, smaller than a willet, and maybe there's one or two other birds in there that you might, maybe that, oh, okay, that's a least sandpiper because it has yellow legs and it's a tiny little peep. So I know those two birds, and that can kind of give you a little bit of somewhere to stand on as you're trying to identify all these other shorebirds. Let's see. All right. Where are willets? Willets are, again, they're pretty big, and where they're breeding, even in migration, they can be very vocal. And so they stand out and they're pretty prominent. Here really on both the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast, we're pretty fortunate because we have willets year round. Now they're not always the same willets, but they're always going to be there for us to basically encounter and use, again, as kind of a yardstick. West Coast, they tend to occupy coastal sites throughout the year, but that's because birds are not, that tends to be like first-year birds that were born in the interior of the United States. They migrated to the coast, and then they decided that next year, why would I fly hundreds of miles to where I'm going to breed, knowing I'm not going to breed? Like most shorebirds, willets tend to not breed until they're about 1 or 2 years old. So again, even if you live in California, there's a chance that you can encounter willets on your shores year round. So just kind of looking, I hope everyone can see the map. The range map here that from eBird kind of shows red is during the summer, yellow is more migration, and then because it's on the coast, it's a kind of narrow band, but if you can kind of see my mouse potentially, Gulf Coast is year-round, up the Atlantic to about, the Del Mar Peninsula, in sort of Virginia, Delaware, they're present year round, and then really up north of there into even maritime Canada, they're present in the summer. I will point out this is an example of a species that has started becoming more prevalent in New England, for example, on the coast in the winter. Um, However, that's not necessarily a new development. Right around um, right around when colonial powers started making their way onto the North American continent and market hunting became a thing, willets were actually extirpated from a lot of the northern part of their range, and so now they're kind of beginning to build their populations back up um, and expand northward. But again, that's sort of a result of conservation efforts and not necessarily that they were never there or because of climate change. It's more the habitat's now restored or still there, and there are just more birds now that can fill in those areas that were vacated because willets are a pretty good size, and if you're hungry, um, they represent a decent food source, and we'll actually get into a little more of that a little later on. But so I've touched on a couple of these already, but why should we pay attention to willets? Well, they're around here year round, so they're not only a good reference if you're a birder, but it's also, it's a familiar face as you're out enjoying the beaches here, and not only the Texas coast, but throughout the coasts of North America. Eastern and Western willets have unique and different life history strategies and migration behaviors. And even within Eastern willets, we'll find that different populations do different things. And so for a long time, when the species was first described, it was actually described as two separate species. And so for birders, it represents an opportunity to get ahead of the curve. And I'll talk a little more of that in a minute, but it's a fun ID challenge that eventually might result in a split. I think of them as being charismatic. They are, like most shorebirds, not super brightly colored, although that black and white wing patterning is pretty striking. But they're big, they make themselves known, and they use a lot of the same sites that a lot of other shorebirds in North America and in the Western Hemisphere use. And they're facing a lot of the same challenges and a lot of the same trends, unfortunately. So they are, in a way, a very good sort of charismatic and still relatively abundant species that we can start paying maybe a little more attention to, and it can inform how we think about and approach not only managing, but appreciating other shorebirds that are either not doing so well or could begin to face the same downward trends if we're not proactive. Again, they can be challenging to identify, like all shorebirds. I think, never go into it expecting to identify every single individual, because it won't happen. It's unrealistic. But that could be true of any bird. But shorebirds really test the mettle of any, either not only learning or beginner birder, but also any advanced birder. So it's a great equalizer, and it keeps us all in the same playing field. So a little bit of the implications for birders. There was a paper published in 2016 with quite a few authors, but Oswald et al. And they basically laid it all out and said, look, a lot of the requirements that we use to determine species that we've applied to all these other birds, willets definitely qualify. And unfortunately, there hasn't been much attention paid since. But with this new wave of splits that we've seen the last 2 or 3 years, for example, Eastern warbling vireo and Western warbling vireo were just split. They have a similar degree of differentiation in terms of, granted, they're passerines and not shorebirds, but they have a similar difference in divergence. And willets have actually been diverging for a very long time, even before the last glacial maximum. Up to 1 million years ago, these two species haven't really been hybridizing. So there's definitely, I would expect that willets be split here pretty soon. And so in anticipation of that, birders can kind of get ahead of the ball here, and we can pay maybe a little bit closer attention. So then when eBird does its taxonomic update, you'll already know that, you know, I have both willets for this state, that state, and this other state. And Eastern willets have an interesting history of wandering. Even though they're more restricted to the coast, even if you don't live in coastal Texas, if we have any viewers from beyond the coast this evening, it's still worth learning and paying attention, because you never know where Eastern willets are going to show up. And even for that matter, Western willets. There is a Western willet that was discovered, I think last week, I believe in the Azores. So way out there in the middle of the Atlantic. So for Western Palearctic birders, even learning to tell the difference could be useful. And again, I think people overlook willets because they're fairly common, and they're, you know, you go to the beach and you see them and you don't necessarily think about them. If anything, it's kind of a relief, because you're like, okay, I know who that is, and all right, it's time to move on to all these peeps that are going to make me want to tear my hair out. Whereas just taking that extra moment to maybe appreciate really what's going on in some of the nuance. So earlier I mentioned eBird status and trends. And so this is the map that, minus the circles, that I pulled up and gave me pause. It's no secret that shorebirds are one of whenever the state of the birds comes out, shorebirds are, the last several years, have been either the #1 or #2 group in terms of declining. I think on the most recent, the 2024 report, shorebirds as a group had declined by 37%. And so there's a little bit of nuance to that, because grassland birds are declining by upwards of 50%. A lot of shorebirds use grasslands, so there's some overlap there. But all that aside, this is the status and trends for eBird data from 2012 to 2022, from May 31st to June 28th. So this is supposed to be when willets are breeding, and they didn't differentiate by subspecies. The lack of differentiation makes it difficult to take away a lot of key points from this map. And the trends that we see are a little bit, they're very interesting. So for example, you'll see the blue circle that incorporates a lot of the northern Great Basin and the Great Plains. Those birds showed an increase in population, or at least detection based on the eBird data. Those are Western willets. I'm gonna ruin the surprise and just throw it out there. Those are breeding Western willets. On the left side there, the Pacific coast had a negative trend. Those would be over-summering Western willets that aren't breeding. So we're seeing a decline in over-summering birds that aren't breeding, which could be a good thing. It's probably not a good thing, because it seems to indicate that there are fewer, either at a population level, all the birds are now going to where they should be breeding, even the ones that aren't breeding, or it means that there are fewer non-breeding birds, which is not a great thing, because over time that means you have fewer and fewer first-year birds that are then going to enter the population. It's a lot clearer. Well, excuse me. It's just as kind of confusing when you look at the Gulf, because we have as some of you may know, we have over-summering Western willets on the Gulf doing the same thing. First-year birds are adults that they're not in the condition to breed, so they hang out where there's a lot of food rather than making that several hundred-mile flight. So at the time that this data is capturing, because we're not differentiating by subspecies, it's difficult to know what's driving those declines. And so that's what got me thinking, hey, we should give people the tools to kind of better learn how to identify these two different, what will probably be species. And I think for the ease of communicating, I'm going to refer to Eastern and Western as separate species for the rest of this presentation. If it drives you crazy, I apologize, but they really do behave very differently. So some considerations for those maps that I just showed. I kind of already touched on this first one. The time that they chose is good, but given that we don't have that specificity, it's not great. One of the things I also want to point out is, even though, granted, the Texas coast in the summer doesn't really get the volume of birder input that it does in the spring or even the fall or the winter, more people live on the coast than live in southern Alberta, at least in terms of the spread of the population. So the fact that the birds are showing the steepest declines in areas that have the most consistent birder coverage is troubling. Not going to get way too much in the weeds, but when these status and trends are calculated, they do smooth and correct for observer coverage, and there's a lot of behind the scenes that goes into it. And I'll get a little bit more into quality of eBird maybe at the end, but in short, my philosophy has always been, yes, not every eBird checklist is perfect, not all eBird data is perfect, but we can't really complain about it not being good if we don't provide high quality data. And so, and there's a lot of capacity for very good science to be done. So that's just my philosophy. And again, kind of as I mentioned earlier, I downloaded the eBird data set for Willet data just for Galveston County, and very, very little differentiation between the two species, which makes it difficult. So we're going to get to, with all that table dressing aside, we're going to get to the reason everybody's here. You guys want to look at Willets and you want to learn just how hard it is to tell them apart. So with that, I'm kind of going to give away the big secret here up front. Look at the calendar. About 50% of, well, I won't put a number on it, but a very big component of figuring out what kind of willet you're looking at is what time of year is it. And frankly, giving this presentation on September 10th, I'm sorry to tell you, there are probably no Eastern Willets in all of Texas right now. At least there shouldn't be. They should have been gone about a month ago. So from basically mid-August through the end of, so September, October, November, December, January, all throughout the winter, the only willets that you should be encountering on the Texas coast, or anywhere in the United States, actually, I'll put it that way, should be Western Willets. Even though they're called Western, they do move from those. It's basically based on where they breed. So they breed in the interior, out west, and then they migrate out to the coasts for the winter. And so I'll just kind of explain on this sort of calendar here. That top bar or I got months, and then that top bar are when you'd expect to encounter Eastern Willets, and it's kind of a heat map. So that sort of peachy color is, they're starting to arrive, but there aren't very many. And then dark orange is expect to see them. Same thing below for Western. There are Western Willets here throughout the summer, but they thin out considerably. Instead of seeing hundreds, a couple dozen typically, depending on the year, is more. At any one site, you wouldn't expect to see more than a dozen or 2 dozen Westerns kind of hanging out. It's not to say that Easterns are more abundant, but they're going to be much easier to find. And so I've kind of noted in there the nuances for this calendar. But again, in the winter, it's going to be all Westerns. So winter Willets are Westerns. There's 3 W's for you to help you remember. Again, once that first week of March rolls around, that's when the Easterns start really showing up, and that's when the Easterns start showing up. And I'm gonna go to this next slide. Hopefully I'm going to do this so I know people can see it. I didn't make up this differentiation. I don't know exactly who did, but I've heard it stated multiple times by different people. There are post willets. When we're talking about during the breeding season, there are post willets and there are mud willets. If you see a willet on a post and let's say it's June 15th and you're at Bolivar Flats, there's a willet sitting on a post and it's yelling at you. I can pretty much guarantee you that is an Eastern Willet because it is on territory. It's upset because willets are always upset when they're breeding, it seems. But they're making noises. They're doing their flights. They do a pretty fun flutter flight that's kind of like a skylark where they'll just hover there in the air and they'll just say peely, 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 just, nonstop. Those are going to be Eastern Willets because they're defending territory. Conversely, so we're kind of facing, I'm going to use Bolivar Flats as the example. So we're looking, into the marshes and we're seeing our post willets, our Eastern Willets. Well, now we're going to turn and we're going to look out at the mud flats and there's going to be all these, a few sanderlings running around and some reddish egrets. Maybe there are a couple piping plovers. It's the middle of the summer, right? So there's not as many birds. Well, we see a couple of kind of stately, large, very pale gray willets standing out there on the mud flat, kind of like the bird pictured here. Those are more than likely going to be your Western Willets because they're not in breeding habitat. They're usually in basic plumage, so they're super gray and plain. So that also helps you out. That's not to say Eastern Willets never use the mud flats in the summer, but typically they're much more concerned about dealing with their brood, and they're much more confined to the salt marsh. So it can help you narrow things down. It's always worth a second look, but again, if we're out there at the flats in January or December, even now, all of the willets are going to be Westerns. It's still worth looking and it's still worth reporting them as Westerns. So first off, I'm going to give credit where it's due. This silhouette graphic comes from an article for Birding Magazine, which is the ABA magazine that Michael O'Brien created. That article is available online, and it's all about separating willets. It's from 2006, so it definitely, I think it could use updating. But Michael O'Brien, for those who aren't immediately recognizing the name, but who are thinking that name sounds kind of familiar, I think I have one of his books. He is one of the authors of the Orange Shorebird Guide. So this guy knows what he's talking about. So this graphic kind of shows you differences in silhouette of the two different species. It's okay if you're looking at these and thinking they're the same picture. They sort of kind of are, but there are some differences. I've kind of gone through the bullets of what he mentions in that article and what I find to be useful in telling them apart for either column by either species. So Western Willets are going to be larger than Eastern Willets, and that's usually the first thing when you see them side by side, if you're lucky enough to see them side by side, that you can kind of latch onto. Won't always be the case, but if you see a willet and it's larger than a greater yellowlegs, and there often are I often encounter yellowlegs and willets feeding in the same habitat, it's more than likely a Western. If it's a little bit smaller than a greater yellowlegs, it's basically got to be an Eastern. There is variation in size even within the two willets, but at the outer end, it's kind of like Sharpshin and Cooper's hawk. A male Sharpshin and a female Cooper's are going to look vastly different. And similarly, at either end of the spectrum for willets is going to look pretty different. Western willets have a much more, they look much more like, I shouldn't say much more, but they look more like a godwit that's been shrunk down a little bit. So even though they're bigger and taller, especially, their bills are longer and tapered, like a godwit. And I think of their necks as being kind of thick, but they're long. And I think part of the reason why they appear thick to me often is because, as I sort of point out on that left column, and I think Michael O'Brien does a very good job of illustrating this, when they have their neck sort of relaxed and they're just walking forward, they often have a bulge, right? Kind of where their throat and their chest meet. And it's something I never was able to articulate before. And then when I read this article, I was like, well, that makes a lot of sense for me. And they also have this sort of round appearance. Eastern Willets, by contrast, they're smaller, they're squatter, they have shorter legs. They look more like a yellow legs, or frankly, more like a tattler, like a wandering tattler. We don't see very many of those in Texas. In fact, I think only one has ever been seen in Texas. So that's not a good comparison if you're used to birds of the Texas coast, but they're just squatter. They have sort of a flatter back and a more a slimmer or more attenuated appearance. And so I promise, hopefully, going into the photo portion, I'm hoping you'll be able to see some of these differences. So as you can see, flat back. Again, this is all a lot of, with shorebirds, a lot of field marks that rely on appearance in terms of structure can be a little bit subjective. If you get, a lot of times our Eastern Willets are, they're breeding here, right? So especially the adults, they're stressed out. They're trying to make sure their chicks get enough to eat and fledge. So they're typically not eating a whole lot. So they also tend to be skinny versus our Western Willets that are here as migrants or just kind of hanging out all summer. They can afford to eat as much as they want. So they also tend to just be better fed. And so I think that sometimes contributes to that difference in appearance in terms of svelte versus a little more rotund. But the bills are shorter on an Eastern Willet, and they don't taper a whole lot. So the tips of the bills are pretty thick, and they look like a chisel. Kind of like a good analogy would be sort of like the bill of a American oyster catcher in a way, where they taper a little bit, but the difference isn't, there's not much of a difference. And then one of the biggest marks you can use, and I have another photo later that can show you where it isn't always 100% accurate, but because Eastern Willets are here to breed, they tend to be in breeding plumage or alternate plumage. And so they have this really dense barring across the neck, the chest, into the belly. So not only are they shorter, but they're also more densely plumaged and darker. So they just look kind of small and dark. To compare that to a Western Willet. So the angle in this photo probably contributes. It makes the bill look maybe not as tapered as it is, but you can notice it, at least to me, it does kind of illustrate that point of it. It becomes a much finer point towards the tip than the base. You can kind of see that bulge in the neck on this bird in this photo. So that's kind of what it's illustrating. Willets eat crustaceans, or they will eat crustaceans. So you gotta watch the bird a little while. Sometimes it's just literally got something in its throat, and that's why it's got a bulge. But oftentimes, Western Willets, when they're here, are very pale gray, and they don't have that dense barring. For the most part, the Eastern Willets do start to kind of wear a little bit, but they replace their feathers sort of, they undergo a molt when they get here. So if you see a bird that's this plain gray, pretty much any time that you see a bird this plain, it's going to be a Western Willet. And if you see Eastern Willets in active, if you see a Willet in active molt, sort of in the middle of the summer, it's more than likely going to be an Eastern Willet because that's when they replace their feathers. to compare, I really like this comparison because as you can see, the bird on the left, it is a Western Willet, but it's in alternate plumage. So both of these photos, and I should plug and say all of the photos were taken by Greg Glassley. And so we're very fortunate that he provides, or he allows us to use his photos. But both of these were taken at Bolivar Flats. The left bird, you can really see that difference in the bill structure compared to the right bird. I included an arrow at the underparts though, because you can see that when Western Willets enter that high plumage, they do get that dense barring. It's just not quite as extensive as the Easterns. There really isn't that long of a period that you would see Western Willets looking like that here, because typically they're still very plain underneath by the time they leave, and by the time they get back, they're pretty worn here on the Texas coast. So I hope that I didn't confuse people more with how to tell the difference. We're gonna get into what I think is the coolest part about Willets and why they really deserve our attention. And we're gonna get into a little bit of, so I just said that there weren't any Eastern Willets here in the winter. Well, where are they? So I prepared the map on the left is just that same eBird status and trends map. And I wanted to draw people's attention to it, specifically for during that breeding period. That's where Eastern Willets are breeding. The map on the right, I hope folks can read. This is a map I created that kind of shows, to me, the really, really cool thing about Eastern Willets. So Eastern Willets on the East Coast and the Eastern Gulf, so Atlantic Coast and Eastern Gulf, they migrate to the Atlantic coast of South America. So they're wintering primarily on the coast of Brazil. This migration takes them through the Caribbean, and the Caribbean still has one of the big conservation issues particularly for shorebirds is there's still a fair amount of hunting that takes place in some of the Caribbean islands. So, and it's both, some of it is subsistence, some of it's just for sport. So a lot of the species that use that flyway, that's a consideration we have to think about. Lesser yellowlegs is another species that, because they migrate bigger distances than a greater yellowlegs, and a lot of the East Coast lesser yellowlegs do use the same migration path. That's why they kind of have their own they're a part of a different working group, right? Because we need to address those specific conservation needs. So if you're a willet that's breeding in Virginia, you're going to winter in Brazil. The really, really cool thing about Texas Eastern Willets is our willets winter on the Pacific coast of South America, Central and South America. And I'll get into the cool people who discovered this in a second. But what that means is, A, they fly over Central America in a single flight to get to Texas in the spring, and conversely in the fall, which is really cool. But it also means that they don't necessarily hunting is not as big a conservation concern for this group. What is a conservation concern is the fact that a lot of the estuary and mudflat areas in Ecuador and parts of Peru, particularly mostly Ecuador, have been converted to shrimp and for shrimp farming and for salt harvesting. This doesn't seem like it would be an issue, excuse me. But the problem is it changes the habitat, and it kind of creates a lot of good habitat. But these shrimp farmers and fish farmers don't want bigger birds like cormorants and herons hanging out and eating all their shrimp and all their fish. So there's a lot of hazing activities that take place to scare birds off of these habitats, and that affects shorebirds. There's also there's a lot of dynamics in terms of mangroves and the berms around these ponds that are created in order to for this aquaculture. And those areas can be good for roosting shorebirds, but they also open them up to predators. So there's a lot of different factors that contribute to the quality, excuse me, that contribute to the quality of that habitat. And so that's not a concern for an Atlantic Eastern Willet, but it is a concern now for a Texas Eastern Willet. And so how do we know that? Well, Sue Heath at GCBO and several other folks published this really cool paper in Water Birds. And over several years, they deployed light level geolocators onto Eastern Willets breeding in Brazoria County. What these devices do is they basically sense light, and then once they're applied to the bird on a leg band, or they're attached to a leg band, and that leg band's put on the bird, and then the bird is then recaptured in a subsequent breeding season. They remove the band, they remove the device, and then they're able to use a computer program to basically look at they use the light that the sensor captured in the day length and light level, and they're able to basically calculate the latitude and longitude of where the bird was. So this is how we know that our birds here on the Texas coast migrate down to Central and South America, which I think is really, really cool. And this is the kind of exciting work that you can do with shorebirds, because not only are they long-lived, they like to come back to the same places to breed, and they often go to the same places to winter. But they're also typically the right size that you can actually deploy technology that's not prohibitively expensive, but also gives you some pretty cool data. So that's my long and kind of gushing way of saying that this is the quantitative proof that our birds are going to these places. What about Western Willets? Well, I'm not going to say they're more boring, but it's a little simpler. So they breed primarily in the interior, kind of Great Basin and northern Great Plains. And then they migrate out to the coast. So we get them here in the Gulf, they get them on the Atlantic, they go to the Pacific, and they will make their way as far south as a lot of those areas where some of our Eastern Willets are wintering. In fact, the default willet in Ecuador and the coast in the winter is Western Willet. There are a few Eastern Willet records that were where there were photographs taken and people were able to identify them to species, but for the most part, most of those birds are Westerns, and Western Willets are doing okay. They've got a much bigger range for breeding and for wintering. And so that insulates them from some of these issues that I was just talking about for the Eastern Willets. However, and I hope this map is somewhat legible, but it basically, I added in some of these arrows and boxes just to bring people's attention to a lot of the stuff I just mentioned, so I won't continue in heavy-handed detail. But basically what I was trying to get across with this is all three populations that we've talked about tonight face issues when it comes to developing salt marsh on our coasts and beyond. But particularly on our coasts, because the Western Willets are here in the winter and the Eastern Willets are trying to breed there. And both species across all these different populations use these sites too during migration. So that salt marsh and protecting salt marsh and in the having high quality sites for them to stop at and to breed in winter is important year round. Addressing some of those concerns in South America on the West Coast is really important for Eastern Willets, as we now know, that breed here, but also Western Willets because they're using the same habitats. However, over in, we're talking Atlantic Brazil, the things that go on there and the conservation implications in the Caribbean don't really affect Western willets, but they certainly affect Eastern willets. And I guess one point too on that previous map of the Eastern Willet range that I forgot to highlight is nobody knows where the break is, right? So we don't know where. I have a pretty good feeling the Bolivar Flats Eastern Willets that breed there probably also go to South America and Ecuador, and or Central America on the Pacific coast. But I have no proof and I don't know, and we don't know what the birds in Louisiana do. So that's kind of this new frontier and gap in our understanding that now that we know where ours go, kind of opens up a whole can of worms of, well, how do we make sure that we're taking care of these other birds too? Because, there's only so much protections and so much we can do. So for comparing Eastern, anyway, back to this map here, kind of the final point being the issues that affect some of those wetland areas, the freshwater wetland areas in the Northern Great Plains, and everything from pollutions and from fracking and agriculture to just the use of water for those enterprises affects quality of wetland habitat. That has a big effect on Western willets. Doesn't affect Eastern willets, but it does affect Westerns. And so this is where I think the willets are a great model for not only birders and people interested in looking at birds, but also shorebird scientists, conservation scientists, and particularly kind of showing people how shorebird scientists tend to think about things, because it's not so much this species is imperiled, we need to save this species, even though that is ultimately what it's about. But we have to think much more refined, or in a much more refined manner, because what is good for one population of shorebirds probably won't help a different population of the same species, because a lot of these species have these much more refined and specific migration patterns and behaviors. So those are just some of the exciting things that willets have going on. Just a couple of my final thoughts. I think it's always good to recognize and pay attention to common birds, because that's not only kind of there are neighbors that really add a lot of context to the places that we love to go. I can't imagine going to Bolivar Flats and not hearing willets singing, and as obnoxious as they can be, and as loud and ear shattering. It's really great to have them out there, and they add a lot of character to the landscape. But it's important to remember that just because birds are common doesn't mean they'll always be that way. And I think we really should not take it for granted, but also make sure that we're doing the best we can to keep it that way. And to that end, even if you think you really know a bird really well, there's always more to learn. If we knew everything there was to learn about, if we knew everything there was to know about every bird, birding wouldn't be nearly as fun. And really, I guess the biggest soapbox I guess I was supposed to be on in this entire evening is, if you feel comfortable, please enter subspecies specific willet data into eBird. As I said before, eBird is only as good as the data it gets, and so it's up to all of us to improve that data the best we can. And so again, if you're out there in the winter, it may seem redundant because you know all the willets are Western willets, but making that extra effort makes it that much easier for us to use that data. And as birders, as people who like looking at nature, paying attention to birds is never a bad thing. As a lister, I have never been, one thing one of my early mentors told me was, counting birds has never put me in bad stead. Basically saying that anytime I stop and try counting birds, I've always found a really cool bird. So if you decide to pay attention to willets, there's a good chance you might be the one that as you're counting through and adding your eBird numbers of all the Eastern Willets in February or March on the flats, you might be the one to find that surfbird or wandering tattler that got mixed up over in, Pacific Ecuador, and no one else would have noticed it because they wouldn't have paid close enough attention. So with that, that concludes my rambling on Willets, and I'll turn it back over to Jesse for Q&A.
Thank you. Maybe as a last exercise, we can look at this picture that you have here and we can all decide whether those are Eastern or Western. You could give us 10 seconds and then tell us what it is, Wyatt. I have an idea, but I might be wrong.
Okay.
I feel like we need Jeopardy music or something. Maybe next time we can do a poll.
I can give you guys a date. That might make it easier for you.
Oh, what?
So there was a date on that photo.
Oh, what's the date? There you go.
The date is July 2018.
Eastern.
I think they are Eastern Willets.
You don't know?
The one in the foreground is definitely.
Yeah.
Part of me wonders if the one in the background might be a Western, but I'm pretty sure they're both. I'm pretty sure they're both Easterns, and that time of year they start looking like this, where they're very worn. You can tell there was something going on before, but and young birds. So I think the backbird might be a young bird. That just goes to show sometimes it's hard to tell.
We had a question from Elizabeth Sears, saying, am I seeing an eye ring on the Western Willet? Or, is an eye ring something that would be a good ID marker for a shorebird like this?
It's not definitive, but I will say, yes, they do tend to have that more prominent eye ring. And I think that makes not sure. I'm going to try going back here. I hope people can still see.
Yes, we can.
Here we go. So in basic plumage, they'll have that kind of broken white eye ring. And I think what it really does is it makes that eye stand in greater contrast. And you basically have this like really blank expression, or maybe blank's not the right word, but a very serene, just like, whereas the Eastern Willets by contrast don't have that. So it's just that dark eye, that beady eye on that kind of darker overall face. And it does give a very different
vibe.
Impression. So it's not definitive, but it's worth paying attention to because it is useful.
A question I had is, you mentioned that Willets, I guess maybe it was just the Western Willets, they like to wander. What does that mean? I guess it's different from migration. It's different from being blown in by a storm or, something like that.
Yeah. So Western Willets, they have a bigger range, so they show up a lot of places. But then Eastern Willets, a lot of it has to do with sort of the distances they tend to cover. So like there aren't very many records of Eastern Willets outside of the coast, but then whenever they do show up, it's way inland and in a weird place. And a lot of that has to do with when Eastern Willets tend to make longer nonstop flights during their normal migration. And so that gives them, they're both physiologically and, well, it's all physiological, but they're physiologically and mentally prepared, we'll put it that way, to make these really long distance flights. And so, yeah, they tend to show up at really weird, when they show up away from where you'd expect them, they're like way inland, like Tennessee, or way out in the Atlantic Ocean, because, a lot of these shorebirds, when shorebirds migrate, they're a little different than songbirds. They'll basically, double or triple their body mass. They put on a certain amount of weight, and then they basically go and they'll navigate themselves, but they go until they run out of gas. And it's not as simple as, this site, this mud flat is been developed, but they'll find a different mud flat kind of thing. They basically are fine-tuned to go as far as they can, and then they basically have to hope that there's habitat where they end up. So the Eastern that's not a great answer, but the Eastern Willets, because they have a longer migration nonstop migration, excuse me, um, they tend to show up in really weird places.
Yeah, I definitely. Basically, they do it because they can, more or less.
Yeah, exactly. They do it because they can. And it doesn't happen very often, but they stop, like the Western Willet, if it starts going in the wrong direction, it's probably not going to be going as far nonstop. So there's more opportunity for it to stop and get reoriented and come back. I'll put it that
Okay.
way. For example, there's a handful. I think there's fewer than half a dozen Willet records for Alaska. There may be only two or three. Um, and they're much closer to Alaska than Eastern Willets are to you know, the
Right.
Tennessee River Valley or way out into the so,
Yeah, that's true.
and there are more Western Willets population wise. So it's interesting that they don't show up more often in places they shouldn't be, but
Well,
they
maybe we'll
also
get more
should be.
eBirders in those places, and then we'll be able to find out.
Yeah, yeah,
Speaking of
just
eBird,
even
how do we enter it in eBird? I mean, since they're not separated yet, what's the way to do that?
so when you type in Willet, it should give you. So for example, like, and even so, and I need to talk to some of the reviewers about tweaking. So you can still report Eastern Willets in Galveston County, even though there are no Eastern Willets left in Galveston County this time of year. If you're in a county, if you're at the flats in the middle of the summer, and you type, WILL into your eBird app, it should give you Willet, and then underneath that, it should say Willet in parentheses Eastern, Willet in parentheses Western. Um, I know for a fact, Jefferson County, so to the east of us, so like Searim State Park, they've set their eBird filter so that Eastern and Western Willet trip the filter because they want to make sure that birders are actually thinking about the birds they're reporting.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Don't worry about, like, if you see willets displaying in the salt marsh, report them as Eastern willets. Don't let the filter saying it's rare scare you. It's not rare. It's just no one reports them.
Right. There you
Subspecies.
go.
Um,
Yeah.
but
Okay, well, if there's nothing else, can you just one last thing? Can you speak to this parcel of land that we are trying to raise money for and why its habitat is so important for birds like the willet or some of the other endangered species that like to stay there?
sure. So it's so the parcel that we are hoping to acquire is, I think, 27 acres that is adjacent to the dune habitat right where Redalon Road meets the beach. So this is sort of the last of what was an inholding within the is it 1,200 acre Bolivar Flat Shorebird Sanctuary. So these were the only pieces within our entire. It was completely encircled by our sanctuary. The habitat itself is more or will be sort of upland prairie salt marsh habitat. The tricky thing is because it's completely surrounded by our sanctuary, the drainage for this site is right into the marshes that then connect to the mudflats that are really critical habitat for shorebirds. So the habitat itself is great habitat for grassland birds in migration, the threatened black rail. Those are the kinds of birds that would be using the site. Eastern willets would breed at the site. But having that habitat developed opens up the door for a slew of complications and problems for us when it comes to protecting the birds that are using our property. It only takes one person that's unscrupulous about, we'll say, changing their oil in their driveway, if it were developed, and all of a sudden all of that pollution is making its way right into our sanctuary that then makes its way down to the mudflats where, on any given day, I was out there today, in fact, and there were I saw 500 Western sandpipers. There were probably more because the tide was coming up. So they were roosting elsewhere, but you know, lots and lots of thousands of hungry shorebirds on a daily basis. Willets that come from, you know, right now there are lots of Western Willets, and in theory, you know, those are breeding as far as Alberta, mixing during the summer and with in spring with Eastern Willets that, are, as I said, are coming from Ecuador. Um, Added to that, piping plovers, some of which are breeding in the Great Lakes region. We have two Great Lakes piping plovers that have decided to hopefully spend the winter with us. One from the Lake Superior in Wisconsin and one from Lake Michigan in Michigan. So it's really it really, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but it really is a unique place that has a lot of tangible connections to a lot of different places on our hemisphere. And we are lucky in Texas that we have more. I mean, I'd have to sit down and do the math, but I'm pretty comfortable in saying that we have more um, undeveloped, or at least, you know, quality shorebird habitat um, throughout the year, you know, so but for both wintering and breeding shorebirds than most other states in the Gulf.
That's very true. Yes.
And so, you know, the Laguna Madre has lots and lots of shorebirds, but, you know, this past spring, there was a day that I went out and very carefully estimated nearly 25,000 American avocets just right there at the jetty, like at one time. I'm not really aware, maybe Delaware Bay. I'm not really aware of another place that has such a high concentration of birds as Bolivar Flats and
the diversity.
shorebirds.
Yeah,
Yeah, short in terms of diversity and abundance on a regular basis, pretty much any calendar day.
Yes.
You know, there are a lot of really important places for shorebirds, but Bolivar Flats is a very special place, and that's why we're
special place.
Yeah, that's why we're hoping.
It's our crown jewel.
It really is. I'm biased. I'm definitely biased because shorebirds
are too. Okay, one last thing. Letha wants to know, do you think it will ever be restored for black rail, or is it okay now? The habitat, I guess.
I think so. Prior to some of the improvements that were made by the developer, we had black rails vocalizing basically right on the fence line. They were on our property, but they were very close. So I don't see any problem with black rails occupying the site. It's just a matter of we get enough. I mean, we're already starting to see some of the marsh vegetation growing up amongst all of they stopped mowing it. So there's lots of great grass and wildflowers. And so it looks really nice now, actually, to be quite honest. So yeah, the habitat's certainly not destroyed or anything. It's just a matter of having that buffer and that protection.
Yes, the buffering for sure. Okay, well, I think that's all we have. If anybody got overlooked or has a question that they think of tonight, feel free to reach out to me, reach out to Wyatt, and we'll do our best to get back to you. But thank you so much, Wyatt, and we will hopefully see you all soon. Thanks
for having me.
Bye-bye.